Hello, everyone. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Friday, January 3rd, where I wanted to talk about the first three chapters in our text, or at least in terms of the text edition that I had listed for our class, but I had indicated that you could use earlier or later editions. The page numbers and the chapter organization might be different. But what we are talking about today is speech in higher education, getting started, and critical listening. And in terms of the textbook, there is an edition of the book on reserve in the GCC library if you needed to access it. Certainly you can buy the book in the GCC bookstore, or you can order it online if you can find a vendor that has a good price. So, or even if they don't have a good price, perhaps they've got fast shipping. Because as you know, we are a very condensed class. We've got basically 20 days in the semester before the semester is over for 3 speeches. So I'm going to skip a little bit, if you can see the notes below, to the second section, which talks about the 3 speeches that we will be discussing. The first speech that we are preparing for now is the autobiographical speech, and that will be due on the 9th, which is a Tuesday, when you are going to be giving a 5-minute autobiographical speech that tells the audience something about you and your life, whether it be a life overview or a hobby or an educational goal, etc. And we'll talk about all of the different ways that you could proceed. One isn't necessarily better than another. I've seen and heard autobiographical speeches that basically give a life overview. Obviously, you're going to have to condense a little bit because you need to put an entire life into 5 minutes. So you are choosing and deciding which elements to highlight. Or what you could do is focus on a particular time period. It could be a particular year or month, even a day in the life of. It could be a particular hobby or interest that you have. Just keep in mind that the focus of the speech should be on you and your interest secondary, that it isn't an informative speech, and that will be coming up in the semester. And there are students who find ways to connect all 3 speeches. So you could, for instance, talk about how you are a basketball fan in your first speech, and then in your second speech you could talk about, in your informative speech, the history of basketball if you so wanted to. If you have absolutely no idea what to talk about for the first speech, I usually suggest that you talk about education because it's something that we all share. It could be your educational goal for the future. It could be about your educational past, or it could be why you are taking an intercession course right now. Nevertheless, I'm going to ask you to upload a recording of your speech onto Moodle, and by that point in the semester, I'll have a folder in our upper section of Moodle for you to be able to upload your speeches. And those would be due by 11:59 p.m. Because ultimately the following day, everyone is going to be viewing those particular speeches and sending me via email a strength and a weakness of each of the speeches that I'm going to be reviewing and compiling. And you are also going to be submitting in to me by 11:59 on the 9th a speaking outline. And we haven't talked much about how to write a speaking outline. We will be talking about that as the semester progresses. And that's also to my email, which is how my grading program works best, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. So this weekend is a good time for you to begin contemplating what you might want to talk about for your first speech. And just keep in the back of your mind the possibilities that you could pursue for speech number 2, the informative speech, which will be due on the 14th. And this is a 10-minute informative speech that teaches the audience something. Perhaps it's about a famous person or a place or a thing or activity. And you will be asked to use at least one audio or visual. You're not required to do that for the first speech because the first speech is basically practicing some of the elements that we are going to be discussing about how to deliver a speech. But by the second speech, we are going to talk about how you could incorporate an audio or a visual, which certainly helps audiences in terms of their learning and retention. And then our final speech for the ending of the semester, that'll be due on the 21st. And this is a 15-minute speech. So notice that the speeches get progressively longer. That this speech is where you're trying to convince the audience of something, whether it be to take an action or to support or not support a particular position. You will be asked to use 3 outside resources. So by that point, we would have talked about how you can find sources, how you would incorporate that into your speech. Again, that's nothing that you're required to do for the first speech. You might want to do it perhaps for the second speech, the informative speech, if you need to look up information about what it is you're going to be teaching us. But in a highly condensed class such as this one, I usually recommend that you choose something for your informative speech that you already have some knowledge about, so that you don't have to spend a lot of time learning information. It's just about how do you translate that information to an audience. So all of these speeches will be due at 11:59 p.m. by the due date, so that the next day they can be viewed by your classmates and by myself. In terms of recording the speeches, probably the easiest way to go about doing this is using your telephone. And I am using my phone in terms of recording, though certainly you could record through your computer. And the GCC library also has resources available to you if you need to record speeches. And one of the things that I'm going to suggest is that you use Moodle to upload your speech, much like I'm using Moodle to upload class material. And when we get a little bit farther into the semester, I'll give you some instructions on how to use YouTube and upload that into Moodle. But for now, I wanted to just briefly touch on plagiarism, the one piece that we didn't have an opportunity to talk about in our last class when we were talking about the syllabus. And plagiarism is basically using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. So it's considered to be a kind of academic theft, intellectual theft, if you will. And it's usually done very deliberately, very consciously. And as long as you give credit to the source that came up with that idea or that language, then you're not plagiarizing, you're doing research. And I would always tell 2 stories to try to encourage students not to be tempted to plagiarize. First actually occurred to me in the early days of my teaching career, pre-internet. And I was reading a paper that sounded familiar. And I couldn't refer to the internet to try to find its original source, because as many sources that exist on the internet to assist students plagiarize, an equal number exists to help professors determine if students are plagiarizing. But I realized after just a few minutes of contemplation that what I was reading was familiar because it was lifted exactly from the class textbook that I had assigned for the class. So the student had literally copied passages out of the textbook. And with a few mechanical errors, I'm not sure if that's because they were sloppy plagiarists or they were hopeful that if there were a few errors in there, I wouldn't be suspicious. But the better story, which occurred around the same time, but not to me, it appeared in all the academic newspapers, so yes, there are academic newspapers, was of a middle-aged professor, that part's important, by the way, middle-aged professor, who was reading papers and realized something sounded familiar, and again, couldn't refer to the internet because it didn't exist in the way that we think of the internet today, so he had to rely on his own memory, and after some consideration, he realized he had not read this before. He himself had written it decades earlier when he was an undergraduate in college. It was one of his old papers. I know the chances of such a thing happening, they seem improbable, impossible even, but it happened. And it had something to do with a fraternity that was recycling old papers from its previous frat members. But the reality is that this student was not only plagiarizing and was discovered to be plagiarizing, but the student was also highlighted in the media because of how absurd the situation sounded. So I would give those two examples to encourage people not to plagiarize. And as you know, things have gotten much more complicated with artificial intelligence. And I don't necessarily I'm not necessarily against artificial intelligence, but I do know that it comes with great cautions. And I encourage you not to use artificial intelligence in this class for a whole host of reasons. The first is that it's not always accurate. So there are stories of artificial intelligence hallucinating, of making up information. And one of my favorites happened actually a couple years ago with an attorney who used artificial intelligence in his court case, and artificial intelligence had provided him with a series of precedents of previous cases that never occurred, even though he had verified through artificial intelligence that they did occur. And basically he was outed by the judge who investigated everything and found out that none of these cases had occurred. So there is, of course, the moral and ethical issue of artificial intelligence using language and ideas that already exist and not giving credit to those creators. And what does that mean in terms of plagiarism, or what does that mean in terms of morality? If you are a sci-fi fan, perhaps you are familiar with the Terminator, when the machines become self-aware. I'm always a little bit hesitant when the machines seem to be as intelligent, if not more intelligent than we are. I think about all of these elements, and perhaps a very old-fashioned idea about learning and not having to rely on outside sources. And the way this class is constructed, if you do the reading and watch the videos, you'll be able to answer the questions on the quizzes, which are meant to just basically reinforce important concepts. Your first speech is about your experiences. Your second speech is about trying to teach us something that you already have, I would suggest, some knowledge of. And the third speech, perhaps in some ways the most important speech, think about how often it is in our society that we disagree, and how increasingly difficult it becomes for us to communicate our position and to debate civilly. And I think that's something that our lawmakers could learn to do better. I've seen my students do better, so I hope that our lawmakers can do better. So I say all of this to encourage you to actually not use artificial intelligence, but to rely on yourself, so that when you're in the position where you need to communicate, whether it be through a video form or whether it be in person or some combination thereof, you have the skills and ability to do so without any assistance from technology, at least artificial intelligence. Because I know that we all use technology on some level or another. It's just a question of balance. So now that I've given you my little speech about plagiarism, I wanted to mention something that was not in the readings. I know I was quite hopeful by assigning 3 chapters that ideally you would have read those 3 chapters, so that what I'm going to talk about in this video is basically reinforcing what you've read. But if you haven't read those 3 chapters yet, please don't panic. You can always read them after the fact. And one piece of information that was not included was a video from an organization called Toastmasters. Toastmasters is an international organization that helps its members improve its public speaking skills. You can see this in the 3rd section in the notes below. And basically, it's an opportunity for people in a non-academic environment to practice public speaking. I've included the website if you are interested in learning more about them. They've got branches basically across the United States and internationally. And they came out with a video about 35 minutes or so long, talking a little bit about how to put together a speech. It basically serves as a kind of summary of what it is that we're going to be talking about over the course of the semester. So I think it's a really good video to begin the semester with, especially if you haven't had a chance necessarily to do the reading. And you can see that that video is on YouTube, and I've included a link. And some of the elements that they talk about in this video are about the different kinds of speeches. You could be giving an informative speech, which you are, and the importance of being clear and concise. Though I would argue it's always important to be clear and concise. Persuasive speech and the importance of motivating your audience and utilizing their emotion, because we are emotional beings. But I'd say that's always the case too when you're speaking. And then what they call the entertaining speech, you're not delivering in this class, but you are delivering an autobiographical speech. I do think of that as entertaining, at least from my perspective. I get to learn a little bit more about my students and the importance of stories and humor in that kind of speech, but I would say that's always important. In other words, I've divided up 3 separate speeches, but they really blend into one another. The importance of practice is emphasized in this video, and this is something that I'm also going to be emphasizing as well. The more you practice, the more comfortable you're going to be with the material. Ask any teacher, the first time they teach a course, it's the most difficult because they aren't as comfortable with the material. I can personally attest to that. So this means preparing early. So I'm hopeful that you're able to use this weekend to think about how you might proceed with your, if nothing else, first speech, although I've given you information about the second and third speech as well. And in terms of the preparation, some things to consider are the logistics, things like the location, the audience, the objective, any research that's required. Now, you're doing this online, so you're going to have to think about the equipment that you've got in order to record. You're going to have to think about things like lighting to make sure that you are visible. You're going to have to think about audio to make sure that your audience can hear you. You're going to think about your background, and you don't want it necessarily to be too cluttered or too distracting. You want to think about your position in front of the camera. We definitely want to see your face. Whether or not you want to show your body in its entirety or you want to show partial body, much like what I'm doing. But the reality is that you want to be able to communicate to the camera the way that you would be communicating to an audience. You also want to think about your attire. And again, you don't have to be dressed formally, but you also want to think about the fact that you are going to be in basically a public forum or a public situation. You want to think about writing an introduction and then ultimately making sure that introduction is in some kind of a speaking outline of keywords and phrases, which we'll talk about further, so that if necessary, you can refer to it. But if you know your material really well, you don't need to even refer to your speaking outline. I liken it to the, let's say, the net a trapeze artist has. A good trapeze artist wouldn't perform without a net, but a good trapeze artist probably doesn't need that net. But you never know what might happen. So thinking about what you're going to do with an introduction, and you definitely want to greet your audience and give your thesis or your main point. And if this sounds familiar, it should. These are the elements you use when you're writing a paper. In fact, students who have difficulty with writing a speaking outline, I suggest that they write out a paper and then they reduce it to keywords and phrases, and that's your speech. And in fact, I suggest the opposite for students who are much more comfortable speaking rather than writing out a paper. I suggest that they record themselves speaking out their paper, and then they transcribe that, and then that is basically the written outline for their paper. You will have something that the video calls a discussion section. Most English teachers call it a body. This is where you give your evidence and your details. And then you need to have some sort of a conclusion, some sort of way to give closure or a farewell to your audience. And then you also have to think about, and this is how it's different from writing a paper, presentation. And the kind of speech that we are giving is a conversational speech in which you are using a speaking outline. And I literally am using a speaking outline. This is my paper copy of the notes below the video that you have. And that is what my speaking outline looks like, just keywords and phrases. And you want to make sure that you are maintaining eye contact, that you are using body language effectively, that you are using vocal inflections so that you're not in monotone, that you're using pauses, which is one of my greatest challenges because I speak quickly. I'm well aware of that. And try to anticipate and answer audience questions in the speech itself, especially if it's going to be a speech that's recorded that you're going to be posting, so you wouldn't necessarily have a live audience. So the video, again, is about 35 minutes, so I'm going to ask you to watch that. And in terms of the 3 chapters that I had assigned, the first, chapter 1 of Speech in Higher Education, talking a little bit about why it is that public speaking is so important in an academic setting. And there is the intellectual element. They call it the intellectual imperative. You'll notice that the textbook gives you a lot of language, which is oftentimes the case that you find in introductory classes, 101 classes, where you're given a lot of vocabulary for that particular discipline. In other words, to be a well-educated person, you want to be able to know some of the principles of rhetoric and public speaking. In fact, if you know the tradition of literature, it began orally, and then it worked its way to written form. The social imperative, that as humans, we interact with one another in order to be able to communicate. So public speaking is important outside of academia. And the consumer imperative that's become, I believe, increasingly important as we consume or listen to the communications of others and try to evaluate strengths and weaknesses. And I've often said that this class can be challenging to teach because we talk about the importance of being clear and making sure that we are being ethical and making sure that we have ethos, which is about ethics, and making sure that we're being honest and valid in our presentation. And we will oftentimes see examples in the real world of the exact opposite. And in fact, those individuals sometimes are rewarded with power or money or position or all of the above. And I've always suggested we need to hold these people accountable to the same standards that we hold ourselves. And that thinking about how public speaking is circular, which might be a little bit more difficult, again, when a recorded speech. Obviously, you as a speaker are giving a message. That message is going to an audience. And if this were in a live situation, you could actually see and hear your audience responses. That's very useful information because then, as a speaker, you can adapt within reason accordingly. This is probably one of the biggest challenges. It's certainly my challenge in teaching this online class is that you're not in front of me, so I can't see your reactions. I can anticipate what some of the reactions might be, but obviously I'm just speaking to a camera in an empty room at this point. So even though I have to act as if there were people who were here, it does get easier with time. I can tell you that I started teaching online really against my will because of COVID-19. I had not taught online before, and of course, if you remember with COVID-19, everything went online, and there was about a week and a half to pivot, and it was quite challenging, I can tell you. But the good news is that I found that with practice, which is always the key, it became much easier to see myself on camera and to speak to camera and to teach online, which is the reality basically of our society now. So much of our world is online, or at least hybrid. So this idea of the audience giving feedback and the speaker adjusting within reason is probably going to be a little bit more difficult if you're speaking just to a screen. But regardless, you do always want to have ethos, ethics, and credibility. Now, chapter 2, getting started, which is where you are. You need to select and narrow the topic. You know that your first speech is an autobiographical speech, but what specifically are you going to talk about? So I was suggesting you could do a life overview. Obviously, you're going to have to condense. You could focus on a particular time period, an important person or thing in your life. Just keep in mind that the focus should be on yourself and not on that thing or that person. Or perhaps you feel more comfortable speaking about education. I will actually be showing some sample student speeches, not delivered by anybody at GCC, so you don't need to worry that one day your speech will be evaluated by a future class. But this will give you an idea of how different students have gone about delivering speeches. They've posted themselves on YouTube, and these are public links, so I'm assuming that they are available for consumption and critique, which we will be doing. Now, you need to determine the purpose for why you are delivering a speech. And for you, it might seem fairly obvious. You need to satisfy the requirement in order to earn a grade, in order to continue on with your education. But the purpose really of the autobiographical speech, I should say, for me is twofold. The first is so that we can get to know each other a little bit better. No, I asked you the discussion form question to introduce yourself to the class, and this is basically an expanded element of that when we talk about the autobiographical speech. It's also a way for you to put into practice the elements that we've talked about and will be talking about delivering speeches and preparing speeches. And that said, I think that it's much like, as I liken it to riding a bicycle. We can talk about how to do it, but until you actually do it, and perhaps even fall off the bike a few times until you learn how to balance yourself, you're really not going to be able to do it. And it's the same with public speaking. We can talk about it, but you really have to do it. And analyzing the audience and the occasion. And I have a little story to tell you about someone, true story, at another school who was not necessarily thinking about their audience and occasion. And this was a public speaking class, and the student was delivering a speech about being true to themselves. And so it was a very philosophical speech. What ended up happening during the speech is that the student began to disrobe. And when the student looked like they were going to be removing their pants, the teacher stopped the student, asked what they were doing. And the student said that they wanted to show their true selves to the audience. Their intention was basically to disrobe and become nude. Might I suggest this person did not think about the audience, which included a teacher, and the occasion, which was a course that they were being evaluated in, or as I like to joke and say, if you learn nothing else in my class, please don't disrobe. But again, you have to think about what is the audience, or who is the audience, and what is the occasion, and what's appropriate in that context. Think about if you were presenting to a group of children, you would probably present very differently, use different vocabulary, maybe even discuss different topics than if you were presenting to a group of adults, let's say. Gathering material, and the first speech is deliberately designed so that you don't need to use outside resources. You already have the information that you need. That said, if you always wanted to learn more about your family history, if you wanted to look up Ellis Island records, I suppose you could. But again, we are in a very condensed format. But if you wanted to interview family members, you certainly could. And then making a speaking outline, which the video talks about, and also our textbook will be talking about. The Toastmasters video talks about keywords and phrases so that you aren't tempted to read. That's the last thing you want to do, is you do not want to read your speech. You want to speak your speech. Think of it as heightened conversation, I believe is the language that they use in the video. Almost in the way in which you would prepare for an important conversation in the workplace. Let's say if you were asking for a raise, that you've probably rehearsed some concepts and some arguments that you would raise with your employer about why you deserve additional income. And you're trying to anticipate some of the objections they might have so that you could address those objections. But of course, you don't know what's going to happen until you actually proceed with the conversation. And it might go in a different direction than what you had anticipated. But the more prepared you are, the more likely it is that you've anticipated a direction already so that you're able to address it. And I think it's very similar with thinking about making a speaking outline, to try to think about keywords and phrases that will remind you of important points that you want to make. In the real world, no one would ever see your outline. You wouldn't even necessarily have to follow it. almost like a GPS that's giving you advice and you decide not to listen to it. And of course, we've probably all done that at some point or another. Sometimes nothing terrible has happened. Sometimes something terrible has happened and we've gotten quite lost. There's just a greater possibility of getting lost. So if you do deviate from your outline, that's the risk you take. And the outline that I want to see is the outline you actually use, not an outline that you construct after the fact for me. I want to see what you are using and how effective that is or is not in terms of the presentation of your speech. And as I said, I've got my outline right in front of me, even though I don't necessarily feel the need to have an outline at this point, because I've talked about this so many times. It's still a good idea. Again, I liken it to the net that the trapeze artist uses. Practicing out loud is very important, even if you have to practice in front of the family pet, which is what you are going to see in the Toastmasters video. And then finally, delivering the speech. So the third chapter that I had assigned is about listening, and listening is just as important as presenting. It's one of the ways you're going to learn public speaking skills, not only you engaged in public speaking, but listening to the speeches of your peers. So, and there is a difference between hearing, which is how you process sound, and listening, which is actually paying attention. And there are a lot of barriers to paying attention. And we probably know these, I think, more intuitively, but they are giving us in the textbooks academic terminology. The internal perceptual field, a really fancy way of saying daydreaming. Basically, people speak more slowly than we can think. And what ends up happening is that we begin to let our thoughts drift, and one goes to another and goes to another. And before you know it, you've missed a piece of information. There's also the external perceptual field. If internal is inside, external is outside. The environment. Things like noises, temperature, lighting, some of those things you can address and you can control. Some of the things you can't control. And as I say to my students in this class, this is not a class in editing. This is a class in public speaking. Your speech should be done in one take, much like the videos that I make for class are done in one take. And that means they won't be perfect, correct. In other words, when we speak live, there isn't perfection either. That's not the goal. So you don't want to splice together a lot of different speeches. It'll be obvious too, I can tell you, that you're splicing together lots of different speeches. So one take. And you are given questions to ask when you're listening in the textbook. In fact, the speech rating handout that I had referenced, that is also part of the syllabus and the course outline in the documents section above, also gives you an idea of some questions that you can ask yourself as well. And we'll talk a little bit about some of these questions as we get a little bit farther in the class. But at this point, I'm well aware that we're at minute 32 and I still have a video that I would like you to watch that's approximately a half hour or so. So I'm going to end with today's discussion forum question. That will be due Saturday, which is the 4th. And you might have noticed that while the Toastmasters video talked about just about all of the major pieces that you can consider with delivering a speech, they don't really talk about nervousness. So I wanted us to just address the elephant in the room, so to speak. And my question is, what suggestions do you have to control nervousness? The textbook gives you some ideas, but my suspicion is that you've probably been in situations before where you've had to address nervousness and you might have your own ideas. So there really is no right or wrong, but I'm hopeful that if you can generate an idea or two, and all of your peers as well, that you'll have some good suggestions, because it's quite normal to feel nervous, especially if you're not used to speaking in front of an audience or speaking in front of a camera. So, as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers and their points, but you're encouraged to. Much like in a live classroom, if somebody said something you wanted to respond, you could raise your hand and respond, but you're not required to. What you are required to is to read your peers' responses and my responses in turn. because I will be responding to you. So I will be responding to your first question, which will be, and I'll be doing that over this weekend, which is about your introduction to the class, and this second question, which is about nervousness. So I'll end by saying that I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on Monday, because you'll have a video Monday through Friday posted by 9 a.m., though I'm aiming to try to post the videos the night beforehand, but certainly by 9 a.m. you should have that video. So we will continue on again at Monday, 9 a.m., with the next chapters that are assigned in our outline. Take care. Bye-bye.